Social histories, really interesting series of talks I think so far. Great to see good audience as well, nice healthy turnout. Just say a few things about my talk. The chronology of my talk is going to be looking, kind of going back into the roots of where the right comes from. So the first few slides aren't really going to be about the radical right as such. They're actually going to be about 19th century Russian conservatism, and hopefully the reasons this will become quite clear as the talk progresses. I think we can't really meaningfully disentangle an early 20th century right-wing movement from like the forces and events and people of the 19th century kind of Russian conservatism. So I just want to give you a bit of an overview about that, just to kind of signpost some of the terms that I'm going to use in a more detailed part of my talk. Also, 1917 itself, I'm really sorry to disappoint you, isn't really a focal point of my talk tonight. Hopefully, they'll become very clear why that is, because by 1917, the radical right movement, if I'm allowed to use that term, had kind of burnt itself out. And as Brendan says, these talks really are about sort of social history, and for me, doing research on this topic, the social history of the right was at its most intense and most lively from about 1905, around the time of the 1905 revolution, the first Russian Revolution, as it's sometimes been known, until about 1908, 1909. After that, the movement kind of burns out for reasons I'll talk about quite briefly. I've got a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk in general terms around the points and a bit about my research. I am going to go through it reasonably quickly. Hopefully the Q&A afterwards will give us opportunity to kind of pick up on things maybe that you'd like to hear a little bit more about in the PowerPoint. So if things particularly interest you, that's our chance maybe to build on them in the question and answer. Okay, so first thing I want to do is kind of show you an image really of kind of who these people were. So this is a group of right-wing students meeting with Nicholas II. I can say with confidence it's around 1910. So by now the radical right movement was quite well established. And that's one thing I want to talk in a little bit more depth about today, kind of who these people were. It's something that confronted me in the earliest conferences I did when I was talking about the very preliminary stages of my research. Scholars would often say, who joined the movement, young or old, men or women, what types of people were involved, professional background, for example. That's something I want to think about a little bit during my talk. And also another point as well, I think this picture encapsulates quite nicely, is that the radical right has a connection to the state. And the nature of this relationship between the radical right and the state is a very important one for understanding the movement, but I think it can also tell us a bit about late Imperial Russia more widely as well. So here's some kind of questions I want to think about, signposts at the start of the talk, things we can maybe think about for the next 30 minutes as I speak, but also things to pick up on the question and answer session. So one of those questions is kind of, when does the right begin? I think any student of the right in any context kind of thinks, what's the difference between, say, traditional, if I'm allowed to use that term, conservatism and radical right-wing politics. And in order to make that disentanglement, we have to look at origins. So that's why I'm starting in the kind of the early 19th century. As I say, what groups? So who are the people, but also I want to give you a sense of the scale of the groups and also the people involved and what the major groups were. I also want to think a bit about mobilisation as well, how the groups generate support. One thing that struck me when I was researching this topic is that the right were far from a marginal presence in Russian life in the early 20th century. They actually managed to generate sizable membership lists, especially in the largest and most radical of the groups. So I want to think a little bit about the reasons behind that. I also want to think about what happens to them, and that's kind of where 1917 comes into a bit more. What happens to the movement once it's kind of gone past its heyday into the kind of the pre-war period, and then throughout kind of 1914 to 17. And also kind of the bigger picture question. So what can study of the right tell us about Russian history? And then more generally, what can it tell us about history? So at the end of the talk, I'll have a few reflections on the radical right in Russia's relationship to maybe other European rights, not in terms of the practical side of things, but in terms of themes. Can we see commonalities? Can we see parallels? What are the problems of drawing comparisons, indeed? And then maybe, as Brendan says, maybe 1 or 2 minutes at the end kind of summing up what study of this movement in the early 20th century can tell us about the radical right now, if anything. Okay, so first then I want to think a little bit about origins, and to look at origins I think we've got to think a little bit about kind of Russian conservative ideology, Russian conservative thought and politics. And I think like conservative politics more generally, kind of a good starting point to consider is the French Revolution of 1789. In the Russian context, you can think about what follows this. In the early 19th century, we can see the emergence of some more significant figures of Russian conservatism. One of these is someone called Nikolai Karamzin, who writes a significant work called Memoir on Ancient and Modern Russia. And in this, he sets down his kind of vision for how he sees Russian society developing and what he thinks would be the favourable social foundations of Russian society to be based upon. So questions such as what is Russia's tradition are explored in this work. Russia's relationship with the West, always a very important one for Russian conservatives. What's the state of the autocracy? Why does Russia have an autocracy? What were the foundations of autocracy? Why did autocracy appear in Russia? The nationality question, and also Russian responses to conservative thought. So we might think, for example, of the French Revolution, but then also what is the uniquely kind of Russian, if you like, take on this? We can see that after the French Revolution, it inspires a wave of kind of reaction in Russia for 10 to 20 years afterwards. Major thinkers setting down their thoughts in response to revolution about the path Russia is to follow. One way of codifying this, I think, is to look at a figure called Sergei Vyov, the Minister for Education for much of the 1830s and the 1840s. In 1832, he came up with a very significant doctrine, sometimes known as the Vyov Triads, also known as the doctrine of official nationality. And in this, Vyov tried to set down a response to events such as, say, the December Revolt in 1825, the emergence of westerniser political doctrines, an idea of what the basis was as he saw it for Russian ideology. And as Vyov saw it, it consisted of three connected parts. The first of these was orthodoxy, so Russian religion, Russian Orthodox religion. Autocracy is the second part, an idea of strong centralised state power. And finally, an idea of nationality and Russian identity. This is adopted by the Russian state in the 19th century as its central ruling ideology. And the reason why I talk about it now is because the radical right that I looked at in a later period did not fundamentally deviate from these central principles. Of course, believing in the same central principles does not preclude differences in interpretation of the principles, different ways in which you apply the principles. But I think it's important to stress that the Russian radical right in the early 20th century was, in an ideological sense, looking backwards to an earlier tradition, an earlier lineage, one that started in the early 19th century, and we can pinpoint Vyov's nationality doctrine. So you can certainly see parallels and trends emerging there. Once Vyov's off the scene, conservatism in Russia continued to develop. We have the emergence of new conservative voices. Among these are development of autonomous groups that operate outside of the Tsarist state and develop their own responses, based in part on ideas that have now been developed and generated from Russia, conservatism, for example from Karamzin or Vyov, to name but two. But these are taken to a more romantic extreme, I think, in the groups, say, Slavophilism, that appear in the 1830s and the 1840s onwards, and then later on, a more radical development of those movements, Pan-Slavism, an idea of Pan-Slavic kind of dominance geopolitically. Autonomous groups operating outside of the autocracy. Again, this has implications in the period I look at. The idea of conservatism existed outside of the state was a problem in an autocratic regime like Tsarist Russia. We also have in the same period, so the mid-19th century and onwards, the emergence of right-wing voices in the press. Mikhail Katkov was one particular example, a very prominent voice, the editor of Moscow News from 1840s, 1850s for a long period of time. He dominated the editorials of this newspaper, setting forth tirades against what he saw as the problems of the day. So the emergence and entanglement of right-wing voices in the sphere of journalism, quite an important contextual development of life and politics and thought in mid-19th century Russia. To give an example of the sorts of things that Katkov talked about, the Polish rebellion of 1863 set forth quite fierce diatribes against Polish peoples within the Russian Empire. So that's an example of the sorts of things that Katkov talked about. Of course, aside from Katkov and the Slavophiles, we've also got conservatism operating within Tsarist autocracy and being developed as an official state policy that we can associate with particular ideas or thinkers or particular movements. After the Great Reforms of the 1860s, that some of you might have heard of, we then have the 1880s and 1890s, what historians have broadly termed the counter-reform period, associated with very important figures like Konstantin Pobedonostsev or the Minister of the Interior, Dmitry Tolstoy, These are very important voices for conservative thought and action operating within the autocracy. So the point I'm trying to make to you now is during the 19th century, conservatism was not just an autonomous idea and doctrine, it also operated very importantly within the Tsarist state. It had a position of preeminence as a kind of an official state doctrine. Can we see this as a high watermark of the ideology? Perhaps we can. Now, all movements that emerge, of course, emerge in a particular social and political context that we need to make reference to in order to understand them fully. In late 19th century Russia, you of course have a society that's undergoing, I think by any measure, enormous change. Picture of a cotton mill in Nevsky, for example, right from the end of the 19th century. Think of the processes going on in Russia. We have urbanisation occurring very rapidly, especially under Minister of Finance Sergei Witta. We have quite accentuated processes of demographic change. As the Russian Empire expanded under the waves of several successive Tsars, we've also got national minority awareness developing as well. As new territories incorporated into the Russian Empire, the Russian Empire's non-Russian people becomes a proportionately greater part of the entire nationality of the Russian Empire. That's got important implications for the groups that I look at. We've also got the presence of Russian liberals, liberal thought and politics developing, especially after the great reforms of the 1860s. Again, when we think of the origins of conservatism, it's often in history defined as a response to the left. And I think in the case of Russia, that's quite opposite. I think when we think of the development of the revolutionary left, for example, in the mid to late 19th century, or the presence of an idea of liberal politics in the public sphere, we can see that the forces were existing politically in order for a right-wing response to react against. The core ingredients by the end of the 19th century were starting to be formed. In the early 20th century, you've got other socio-political developments that are of great significance. For example, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 demonstrates ethnic tension in the Russian Empire. We've then, of course, got the conflict of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905, a failed war and a conflict crisis that have great implications for how conservatives saw the Russian Empire. And then, of course, just following on from that, we've got the 1905 revolution itself. Following on from the failed war, we've got a very widespread series of strikes and popular support, popular rebellion and uprising. So, if you think of those kind of developments right from the early years of the 20th century, you've got a society that's in flux. A society that some pessimistic observers might say is in chaos and crisis. This is something that's quite important for the horizon period that I looked at. And the status quo in Russia was fundamentally not in a good position, and they needed change, either back in time to something they see as more positive, or forward in time to a settlement quite unlike the social situation as it existed in the early 20th century. The broader point I'd like to think about is how when we think of the emergence of a movement, we need to think seriously about the context from which that movement unfolds. So my research, really, the most deep years of kind of development, of 1905 for the several years afterwards, up until about 1908, 1909. That's when you see the emergence of a much larger, what some historians have seen as, an organised right-wing movement in Russia, unlike movements that were seen before. This starts on a small scale, and in fact it doesn't start in 1905 even. To muddy the waters, the chronology is not clear. The Russian Assembly appears in 1901 in St. Petersburg. Now, this is a very small-scale group. At its peak, after 1905 I should say, it has only several thousand members. Numerically, it's not a significant group. However, it does have elements in it that you can see map on very clearly to the much larger radical right that appears after 1905. You can see an idea of regional development. So once the central group is appearing in Petersburg, you then see groups appear in Kharkov and Kiev. The Russian right was a regional phenomenon as well as a metropole one. The membership of the group, in contrast to some of the groups I looked at from a later period, is quite professional. Many doctors involved, members of the clergy, gentry figures too. However, it does have a somewhat militant tone in its ideas. The ideas that I mentioned several moments ago about Uvayov are still there in the movement. You can see Russian orthodoxy, Russian nationality, Russian religion, and also the idea of a strong Russian state, all being very important, but it somehow allies them with a tone that's slightly more militant in terms of how it perceives the enemies of the Russian Empire, something that's very important in a later period. There's also an idea of what is authentically Russian that's very key to the group. The group styles itself very much as a group that's about culture, not politics. An idea of anti-politics is very important to the Russian right, and indeed it's important to the right as we see in the world today and as we see in later decades. That's something that has its origins, I think, in the Russian context, in the context of the groups I look at, in this group that appears in 1901. So although the group isn't numerically significant, ideologically it's quite interesting. I should also say several of the most prominent members of the later radical right, the larger groups, appear in this group. There's an overlap in terms of personnel, a very imperfect one, but you do see people emerge active in groups like this and in large groups, which I'm going to mention in just a few moments. What I think a group like this can make us think about is whether, through adopting the value of triad, was this a break with earlier traditions and precedents? To what extent did it offer something that was quite novel for life in late Imperial Russia? The key year of development, for me, is the 1905 revolution. This is when we see the emergence of a much larger right-wing group. Before the October Manifesto, going back to April of that year, we can see the emergence of a group called the Russian Monarchist Party in Moscow, led by one Vladimir Greenhut, quite a charismatic orator, quite a well-known speaker, involved in the newspaper Moscow News, much like Kaplan had been before him. And then in the spring of that year too, we see another group called the Union of Russian Men, led by one Pavel Sheremetyev, who had been active in gentry conservative circles a few years earlier. What we're seeing then, as we see in other sectors of the political life in Russia at the time, is a wider process of party formation. However, political parties have a very vexed relationship with the autocracy, and indeed their legal status is not certain until October of that year. What makes an even larger movement from the right emerge is the October Manifesto of 1905. In its promulgation of new civil rights, an idea of religious rights, and the creation of a Duma, a parliament, we see contextual developments emerge that impel rightists into action. We see a process of resistance occurring on the radical right, resistance to what they see as the negative elements of the constitutional settlement that emerged in Russia in the years following 1905. One of the largest groups we can look at is the Union of Russian People that appears in October 1905. So I'd like to say a little bit more about this group, because it's the biggest group, numerically the most significant, and also I think quite interesting in terms of what it does and what its activists get involved in. It's a response to a challenge of mass politics. The Duma, of course, is going to involve different people in the political process than have gone before. People are being mobilised generally politically during 1905, in terms of both within organised political parties, but also in terms of popular understanding of politics. This is a response to such processes. Unlike earlier groups, such as the Russian Assembly, this has a very large membership. It's led by Alexander Dobrovin, doctor, picture of him opposite, and it creates an idea that I think we see a word that is very frequently debated now, but seldom clearly talked about or understood, populism. A populist appeal directed to peasants and workers. So it's a group that's very actively interested in increasing its social support, and it wants to talk to other people in society rather than the more narrow, more prescribed set of gentry interests that earlier conservative groups considered to be the central plank of their support base. Unlike earlier groups, such as the Russian Assembly, we know that this group was involved in violence to some extent. It appeared in October of that year. The pogrom wave of 1905 had appeared earlier. It is difficult, as certain historians have speculated, to clearly connect the activists of this group to the pogrom wave, as the group did not exist. However, I think it's very, very likely that some personnel at least were involved, and I also know from looking at documents in Russia and elsewhere that you can certainly see sporadic involvement of activists in instances of violence against what they saw as Russia's enemies. For example, Jews, socialists, and of course, even when they're not involved in violence, the tenet of this group raises political temperatures. And that's something that's very, very important to think about. More widely, we can see the group is interested in mobilisation. The foot soldiers of the movement become involved in demonstrations, the crowd is an important device, and rallies as well. Ideologically, we can see parallels between this group and earlier movements. So Rivalry of Triad, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality is still present. We have an idea of what they call Russia One and Indivisible. We also have, of course this is not new, but I think it's something that is certainly a very prominent part of this group's ideology and its raison d'etre, deep hostility to what they see as the enemy other, particularly liberals, socialists too, and also non-Russian populations, especially Jewish subjects and citizens of the Russian Empire. There's also, developing within this group, as we see in right-wing movements in Europe at a later stage, and indeed in the world today, populist nationalism, a claim that only this group was on the side of the Russian people, the truly Russian people, a syntactical device often taken to mean the peasantry, but more widely, I should say, what they see as ethnic Russians within the empire. So the group has a deliberately exclusionary element to its ideology. In a social sense, an interesting part of the group is its approach to the land question. Of course, typically, you might think a group such as the Union of Russian People that might think of itself in certain respects as a conservative group would have quite an approach to the land question where they didn't want to give too much away. Well, in fact, certain people within this movement have an idea about the land question which involves giving land away from the gentry towards the peasantry. Again, based on the populist ideas, but of course that would generate tension between conservatives who have been involved in the movement for a longer period of time and new activists who want to see more radical ideas of land expropriation towards the peasantry. It's not typically what you might expect from a group of this type, and it does generate tension within the group. So much so, in fact, that one of its conferences in 1907, they're on the verge of fights breaking out between different activists and delegates over this issue of land. So important to the group's idea. So here's a front page from one of the newspapers involved with associated with the group, the Russian Assembly, the Messenger of the Russian Assembly front page from the 13th of April 1907. Now, who is joining these groups and how many of these people are there? Well, I was quite surprised when I looked in the Russian State Archive at the police records that give an estimate of around 350,000 to 400,000 if you add up members of every right-wing group in the Russian Empire that they could think about in their consideration. The vast majority of these members belong to the Union of Russian People, and of course a gigantic membership does not imply huge activism. It could be that there's people running around in villages and getting many peasants to add kind of, if you like, unsigned signatures to these petitions that now actually have a much smaller number of signatories attached to them. That's what I believe in part can account for the very inflated figure that we come across here. However, I think there's no doubt that very significant numbers of people are becoming involved in the movement just after 1905, reaching a peak numerically around about 1906 to 1907. Many of these signatories are peasants, but we also have evidence of workers and students joining the movement, hence why the picture appeared earlier. We also have professionals joining. We have the involvement of members of the clergy. The social composition of the right varies depending on the group in question. So, speaking in very general and crude terms, the Russian Assembly, even after 1905, has quite a professional membership. There aren't that many, for example, workers or peasants involved in the movement. Some of the newer right-wing groups that pop up after 1905, for instance the Union of Russian Working Men in, I think it's Kiev, they're mostly founded on an idea that workers are going to form the cornerstone of the membership of that movement. So we can see certainly social diversity and diversification following the 1905 revolution. And this influx of new members, of course, changes how complex the groups, changes their composition, and also changes the sorts of questions that are debated within the groups. This in turn leads to tensions between different generations and classes of members in terms of the direction they want to take the movement forward after 1905. This would have implications for the development of the movement more widely. So, I'd like to say a little bit there about strategies and tactics. These groups operate outside of the state. They use demonstrations quite widely. They're very interested in the use of ritual, and I gave a whole chapter of my book over to this subject because I think it's important to note how symbol and aesthetic are very important to these groups, perhaps even more so than doctrine. When we need to think, for example, about the use of religious symbols, how they appeal to people symbolically, I think that says a little bit more about how the groups operated in a cultural and social sense rather than how their ideas worked. It's not to say don't take the ideas seriously, just to think about techniques and tactics. Occasionally we can see involvement in violence, mostly from members of the Union of Russian People, it's the most violent of the groups in terms of its actions. They also communicate to each other in congresses, and that's why I think I can be bold and call these groups a movement, because because they are practically talking to one another after 1905. So you do get an idea of strategy there, I believe. And this activism continues after 1905 to 1906. We also see, quite interestingly, involvement of women in some of the groups, inclusive but still very prescribed role for women. An idea of charity as well, become involved in charitable endeavours. The radical right's not all about violence, there's also kind of an idea of charity and what they see as a social benefit for the population more widely, built into these groups, kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but we will help you mentality appearing. And we also see campaigns to change education at Russian universities, and in one of my writings I tried to kind of follow up on this idea of kind of what education meant for the radical right and what their education plans were in terms of the future for Russian education. They're very interested in developing a student movement and involving more young people in the movement, because much as other right-wing groups saw at a later period, they realised that young people were the future and they needed to involve them. As you might expect, active in terms of distributing propaganda, holding seminars and meetings where members can talk to one another, share ideas. They've also got parliamentary presence. This isn't true of the entire movement. Certain groups do not ever become involved in this in a formal sense. However, a splinter group, the Union of Archangel Mikhail, led by Vladimir Purishkevich, who was quite known within the Duma for his kind of long-winded vitriolic speeches, had a parliamentary presence from 1908. So from that period, we can see the delegates being sent to the Third and Fourth State Duma from the radical right. And as you might know from your study of Russian history, after the Duma was restructured to be more Russian in spirit, that becomes a reality for these people, becomes a real possibility in terms of who they can send. So one thing I want to talk about then before kind of like moving on to kind of conclusions is kind of the relationship to the state. I think that tells us quite a lot about how these movements operated and gives us an idea about how they worked in a practical sense. Now, I know from reports I've seen in the Russian State Archive and looked at elsewhere in other sources that they did receive some support from figures within the autocracy, particularly from the Ministry of Finance. We can see that there are financial disbursements being given to certain people within the movement. However, the picture that emerges from the sources I look at is very piecemeal and actually quite fragmented. Funding of the radical right is quite sporadic. Certain members of the Russian states and the Russian hierarchy do have a sympathetic attitude. Nicholas II himself has a sympathetic attitude to some of the leading players from the right-wing movement. In contrast, the Ministry of the Interior, tasked of course with keeping order within the Russian Empire, the Russia's police, they're more suspicious about the radical right. And you might think the 1905 revolution, huge unrest, chaos across the empire, strikes, disorders, peasant unrest, autonomous activity from any large-scale movement in such a social context would surely be highly suspect. And indeed that's true too for the radical right. Most ministers don't have a lot of trust for them after 1905. So here's, for example, a police report, unfortunately it's unsigned, which is circulated during August 1907, addressed to Ivan Tomashov, the Governor-General of Odessa, something I found in the Russian State Archive several years ago. And in this source it talks about how the official was in good spirits due to his categorical refusal to admit the flags of the Union of Russian People and the Union of Russian Men to participate in a spiritual procession going through the city centre. Neither I nor the Governor-General of Odessa, reference to Tomashov, would consider allowing participation in this group, given that the procession they speak of was purely spiritual. They didn't want, as they saw, political elements being introduced to religious procession, especially taking into account anxiety within the city. So we can see here, for example, in this source, quite a suspicious attitude towards the radical right. There's not a lot in here in terms of ideological opposition to the right, but they're worried about the potential for civic disorder that they're going to present in the Russian Empire. And I came across several sources like that when I was doing my research. Now, I know this talk's kind of it's pitched at quite like a general level, so I want to think about kind of the right itself as kind of a concept. And particularly this idea of like novelty, is the right new, in inverted commas. So ideologically, we can see maybe it isn't completely. We can see that major thinkers and activists from the group, such as one B.V. Nikolsky, who's associated with the Russian Assembly, they share the precepts of Nicholas II in an ideological sense. Those elements I talked about from Uvayov was something that the groups all talked about in some way, shape or form. And you can see it very clearly in their manifestos, in their petitions, in their leaflets, in their printed propaganda. The question of the state too, fundamentally these groups are committed to autocracy. They do not want to change that fundamental element of Russian state and Russian society. We can also see, in terms of the land question, there's a kind of a tension within the movement. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we can see opposition to radical ideas of land expropriation. So if I take, for example, the 1906 manifestos of the Russian Monarchist Party, Union of Russian People, they don't talk too much about giving away lots of land to the peasantry. So it's potentially a dangerous thing that will take land away from the gentry, who they want to count upon for their social support, or at least one part of it. So in that sense, ideologically, many of these groups are not producing novel ideas. There's also a question of power. Where does power lie in any given society? The state, of course, in Russia, autocratic state, not going to be keen on sharing power with any group that pops up, even one that purports to support it, provided, of course, that group is operating from outside of the autocracy. So that relationship between the state and the right, I think, is quite an important one to consider. We think of how far these groups are kind of like a novel development in Russian society. I do want to talk a little bit about what happens to these groups as well. The focus period for my research is from 1905 to like 1908, 1909. That's when most of this seems to happen. We can see things happening afterwards though too. By the First World War, 1914-17, most groups have declined in importance. If you look at membership figures in the Russian State Archive and in other sources I've looked at, they've dwindled enormously from that peak I've shown you earlier, from around about 1907. So there's a catastrophic collapse in terms of support between about 1907 and 1914. We might ask why that is. Now, much like we're seeing with UKIP at the moment, post-EU referendum, a lot of these right-wingers rely on ideas of crisis. Now, once crisis subsides, the raison d'etre for existence is thus denied. For radical right, 1905, the idea of this kind of new political settlement coming into being that they needed to oppose to keep an autocratic Russia one and indivisible, that was something they relied upon ideologically and tactically for their being. That's why they appeared. Once the crisis is put down, and of course the revolution does in a kind of a formal sense fail, once that's put down and the autocracy reasserts authority, the right is denied a major reason for its existence. The radical left, for example, are mostly suppressed, liberalism's been constrained, its ideological opponents have been muzzled, one of its reasons for being has been constrained, and that takes away from the support of the radical right. But also internal developments are occurring that we can point to. Factions and corruption are rife in these major parties. It's partly personal. Some of the major leaders hate each other on a personal level, but also it's to do with financial disbursements that are being given by the state and being given by people within the right-wing movements going missing. We know from looking at sources that there's widespread corruption, generates enormous tension and animosity, and the right undergoes a series of splits. Thank you. A series of splits occur in the radical right leads to diminished importance by 1940. That doesn't mean the right goes away completely after the war starts. For example, you can see involvement in wartime politics. People like Purishkevich are still active in the State Duma at the time. And then also we can look at particular examples. For example, murder of Rasputin, Vladimir Purishkevich, leader of the Union of Archangel Mikhail, along with Dmitry Pavlovich and Felix Yusupov, he's involved in that murder, right? He takes it upon himself to become involved in this killing of someone he sees as a major opponent of autocracy, someone who he sees as bringing shame to something, a cause that he very much supports, even though he is in some respects quite critical of Nicholas II as a person. Now, during the revolution of 1917, the radical right are not one of the more important forces operating within it. During and after 1917, we can see that the movement splinters completely. Some of the people leave Russia. Some of them become later involved in white forces. That's something I would personally like to know a lot more about. I don't know too much about it at the moment because I simply haven't done the research. But there is certainly something of a carryover in terms of the people involved and then later right-wing movements. I don't know, white movements I should say. I don't know how many there were, absolutely. We know some leave Russia. We also know some of them stay and are not always subjected to particularly harsh punishment. You might speculate on the reasons why for that. It could be that they're seen as harmless cranks with no longer any political importance, or it could be that the state simply has its eye on other things, bigger fish to fry by that stage. So, to kind of conclude then, sort of, before I kind of think about wrapping up, this distinction then between kind of radicalism and conservatism, where does it lie? Well, in one sense, you can point to these groups being radical. You look, for example, at their tactics, the involvement in violence. Maybe that's not something you'd expect typically from a conservative group that said it was going to shore up support for the autocracy and keep the state strong. so maybe not something you'd expect. You can also see emerging criticism of particular individuals associated with state power. This is not limited to those, it also includes Nicholas II, leading activists showing in this sense an anti-establishment idea that I think differentiates themselves from more traditional conservative groups. There's also an acute sense of kind of pessimism, decrying the Russian present and yearning for a different vision for Russia's future. And of course there's that rejection of the post-1905 order by some of the major leaders of this movement. On the other hand, if you're thinking about conservatism, you can think of how they sought to preserve autocracy, even as a semantic device. I think it's quite important that they keep saying that, and also their support for Russian nationalist ideas. The radical right maybe took them to new ends, but they weren't new ideas in themselves. We can also see that war against the other was not new or exclusive to the right. For example, if we think of something like anti-Semitism, I think it's very important to say that was something that was circulating within the Russian establishment much longer before the right even appeared, and indeed would continue to be so afterwards. They're not unique in thinking these ideas, but they maybe act upon them in maybe a slightly different way to certain other actors within the structure of society in late Imperial Russia. But the idea in itself is not unique to them, and I think that's important to stress. Many groups, of course, sought to work for the state. Even if they're not trusted, they will offer support for what they saw as good Russian autocracy. Right? So fundamentally, it's not they're trying to shift power too much away from the state. That does vary, though, depending on the group in question. We can also see elements of kind of conservative Russia long since within these groups. So religious symbolism is one key point. Their symbolism, maybe their ideas, their symbols weren't new in themselves, they weren't innovative. Just to think then, kind of by way of conclusion then, reflections on right-wing groups elsewhere. So we've got Europe. Well, later on you can see, at the time I should say, but also later on, you can see some parallels with those groups that kind of straddled the line between kind of fascism and kind of right-wing and radical right politics. Groups like the Pan-German Union, for instance, Action Française, League of the Archangel in Romania later, you can see some parallels. You can see that they share with these groups an uneasiness with path development and actions to status quo, and that opposition to the status quo, that uneasiness with it, I think is quite a key part of the radical right. But of course, they don't sit completely apart from that. As we've seen, they adopt elements of state ideology. So it's kind of a blurred line, really, in terms of where they sit on the political spectrum. One of the questions that really interested historians who first took a look at this movement, very prominent historian of late Imperial Russia, Hans Rogger, he talked about it in an excellent essay on the Union of Russian People, what it was in the early 1960s. You know, was there a Russian fascism? He asked the question. And you can certainly see some resemblance. But I think Rogger was right then, and is still right now, to point to the very important contextual differences. That means as historians we need to be very careful and judicious about how we categorise these groups. If we think of fascism, for example, we can see very important differences in the environment, differences in social context, differences in ideology. The status of nationalism and racism in these movements was different fundamentally from the groups that I looked at. So although I think you can see parallels in certain respects, I think we've got to be very, very careful about drawing too close a connection. So then to conclude, I hope I haven't gone over too much. The rise of right before 1914, I think it's evidence of Tsarism's weakness. The idea that groups had to pop up and purport to support the Russian autocracy was in itself a sign that the autocracy maybe wasn't doing its job of running Russia and consolidating and codifying conservative ideas and practice particularly effectively. And that's, I think, one of the key points of my work, and the point I think that is not just interesting about the radical right itself, but also how the Russian state and how Russia was developing at that time. There's also, I think, quite interestingly, a paradox here, that the politicisation of Russia that many of these groups purport to oppose is what actually gives the space for these radical groups the wherewithal to engage in mass politics. That kind of vacuum that's created after 1905 gives them the space to emerge, and yet it's what they purport to be against. Quite interesting, I think. So we can see a kind of an idea of reaction in these groups allied to radical politics, and that distinction, I think, is quite interesting. I also think when we look at parallels elsewhere, and even parallels in the world today, although we can see certain kind of interesting parallels that we can maybe talk about maybe in the Q&A a little bit more, and also kind of the very kind of obvious things that jump out at you, so the kind of populism, an idea of groups being the authentic arbiter, the sole settled arbiter of what the will of the people, whatever that means, what they purport to represent. I think it's most useful to look at these groups as a phenomenon of themselves, look at them in the context of the time in which they appeared. Doesn't mean comparative history isn't useful, I think comparative history is a method, not an end result. So I think as we look at comparisons, we can tease out the complexity of how history evolves. And I think it is useful to look at these groups in context of European and the global right at the time, and also in the present day. So that's all I really want to say for my talk itself. And what I'm really interested in hearing is your questions and picking up some of these points of discussion.